Welcome to Sustainability Now, an exploration of technologies and paradigms to shape a world that works. Designed for socially conscious entrepreneurs and individuals interested in responsible stewardship of the planet. Sustainability Now covers food, energy, housing, water, waste, health, economics, and consciousness. Welcome to your community, Sustainability Now, with your host, Mira Rubin.
Welcome, everybody, to Sustainability Now, technologies and paradigms to shape a world that works. I'm your host, Mira Rubin, and I am truly honored to share with you Stephainie Seneff. Stephainie is a doctor and is a senior research scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She's got a BS degree from MIT in biology and a PhD from MIT in electrical engineering and computer science. For the last 12 years, and this is why we are so delighted to have her here with us, she's focused on the role of toxic chemicals and micronutrient deficiencies in health and disease. And her special emphasis is on the pervasive herbicide Roundup and the mineral sulfur. So many of you will recognize that Roundup and glyphosate are pretty much one and the same. And so she has authored over 36 peer-reviewed journal papers over the past few years on these topics and has presented at many conferences within the naturopath and functional medicine communities. And we're going to share her very, very extensive list of resources and references and papers on the sustainabilitynow.global website. Stephainie, it truly is an honor to have you here. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Well, you know, you have been on the cutting edge for 12 years. Well, more than that, because you had experience with AI. You were pioneering AI for how long before that?
Pretty much my entire career before that was working on developing dialogue interaction, spoken dialogue interaction between computers and humans. We probably built the very first human-computer dialogue system way back in the late 1980s. So it's been a long time coming, but it's awesome to see it out there now, Siri and Amazon Echo, and it's just really great.
And this is an outgrowth of your work.
Yes.
That's extraordinary. And so now you've been blazing trails in this other arena.
Yes.
And we haven't seen it take quite the fruit yet.
No, that's true. It's been a very difficult ride, I have to say. I've been very surprised at how hard it is to get people to be aware of what's going on with Roundup, because I think it is the most dangerous, and maybe not the most toxic, but the most dangerous chemical in our environment today, because we think it's safe. And, people don't even study it. They see the birds are dying. They don't even think of glyphosate as a possibility because it's safe. And that is a very, very dangerous situation when the regulators think it's safe, the government thinks it's safe, the media think it's safe, and it's not safe. Well, it's so pervasive.
It's so pervasive, and I think you really make a very, very good point, because what you're doing is trying to go against the tide of a very standard conventional belief.
Yes.
And so if you're sounding the alarm, people are going to dismiss what you say just by virtue of the fact that it goes against popular understanding. Is that true?
I think it's a combination of they don't want to believe it, and they want to trust their government, because once you do believe it, then you say, oh my God, the government's not taking care of us like they should be, because they're letting this happen. The fact that the government is failing us to that degree, I think it's shocking. And I think it does sort of unravel you when you start to think, for me personally, once you realize what's happening to us and how oblivious the government seems to be. When you look at the autism rates, if 1 in 20 boys in New Jersey now has autism, that's just outrageous.
So now I want to back up a little bit and just say, how did you get involved in this search? Because didn't you start
with
by
autism?
Research? Okay, so let's kind of start at the beginning. And what what made you look at autism in the first place, and what made you make this connection?
I would say I had an interest in autism from way back. I remember when I was a teenager, I think there was a show on television about the refrigerator moms. And I remember even then thinking, this is not right. This is not what's going on here. It's not these mothers that are, there's something wrong with that child, you know, back then.
What are
Then
the refrigerator moms?
they had this idea the refrigerator moms were like, they were very, you know, unable to
Rigid.
love their frigid moms that weren't able to love their children. The children became autistic because of that. There was like this notion at that time. They didn't understand. They started seeing very rare cases of autism at that time. And it got, you know, it gradually got worse. It really accelerated around 2000. I had a friend back in the early 1980s. She was my best friend at the time. She had a son who got a DPT shot, ran a high fever, had seizures a week later, and later was diagnosed with autism. And that kind of planted a seed early on in my life, because it was very rare at that time. And of course, I was distressed for her, but also quite fascinated with the disease, you know, to see how odd, how it just didn't make any sense, autism to me. So I was intrigued by it. And then I saw the rates going up dramatically around 2006, 2007 timeframe. I said, there's just got to be something going on here. It's not genetic. I mean, there's a genetic susceptibility. Certain kids have genes that make them more sensitive to the environmental toxins, but it's the toxins that are causing the epidemic. And it has to be some toxin that's going up exactly in step with autism, which is glyphosate. Glyphosate matches perfectly. And when you look at the rise in glyphosate usage, first you look at the kids in first grade that have been diagnosed with autism according to the school system. We plot that over time, and you plot the integration of glyphosate usage over the previous 4 years to get sort of a sense of how much glyphosate were they exposed to in that early phase of their life, from the age of 2 to the age of 6. You look at that, integrating the glyphosate over those 4 years, you get an exact match on those two curves. I mean, the correlation is 0.99. You just never see correlations like that. Perfect match.
Wow. We should be screaming this from the rooftops.
We should be. And it's like people say, oh, well, correlation doesn't mean causation. I mean, they're able to dismiss everything. It's so incredible to me. We see these very strong correlations with all these diseases. You look around, everybody's fat. I mean, there's so many people who are fat. I shouldn't say everybody, but we have a huge problem with obesity. People are bigger than I ever saw as a child. It's almost common now. I mean, you're not shocked anymore. Glyphosate, I think, is causing that obesity epidemic, and it's not the person's fault. Their body is driven to store fat because of the glyphosate.
So I think we should back up, because there may be people listening that are not really even familiar with what glyphosate is. They may not have heard of Roundup, and they don't know how they're being exposed to it. And maybe can you just sort of fill in some of the blanks? Well, we're going to play the Glyphosate for Dummies game, because not that anybody out there is a dummy in any way, please don't take offense. What it is that you have such a strong scientific background. I need you to dumb it down for me. So that
No, it's good.
I understand the mechanisms.
Right. And of course, I wasn't aware of the extent of the exposure until I started looking. And that's the thing, people are not aware. The food looks fine. You know, you buy the food, you don't realize it's got toxic chemicals in there. And the problem is that glyphosate is used extensively, starting with the GMO crops. So those were ramped up. So they designed these crops using genetic, you know, GMO technology. They inserted a bacterial gene into the crop that was like a Superman gene. It protected them from glyphosate. Otherwise, glyphosate kills all plants.
So let's back up. For folks that don't know, glyphosate is used as a fertilizer, herbicide. Okay, and doesn't it have? It wasn't one of the original patents as an antibiotic?
Yeah, an antimicrobial agent, essentially an antibiotic. Yes, it's been patented as an antibiotic, a pipe cleaner to remove, to strip metals from pipes.
Wow.
And then they discovered accidentally that it killed plants, and that's when they got the idea of using it as a weed killer.
Okay, so they started spraying it, but
yeah,
then they modified. Say it again.
Well, so they had to kill the weeds, like they would typically maybe apply glyphosate, kill everything that's growing on the field, wait a couple of weeks to let the glyphosate disappear, to let it break down, and then plant the crop. And then they couldn't use the glyphosate on the crop because it would kill it. So they had to be very, very careful. If they're going to use glyphosate on the weeds, they had to be very careful not to attack, not to stay away from the crop. It makes it much, much harder. Whereas now you could just spray the stuff from the air spill it all over the crop doesn't die because of this
Because they
GMO
modify.
gene.
Okay. So who is they? Let's start with that.
Well, okay, Monsanto. Monsanto is the patent holder and the originator of glyphosate as an herbicide, and that's been their product, and it's become come out of patent now, so it's much cheaper now, and that's also increased its usage worldwide. It has been going up faster in other countries lately because of this economic situation, that it's cheaper to use than it used to be because of it no longer being under patent. The U.S. was really a leader. We've always been ahead of everybody else. We use more glyphosate than any other country. I think we use 20 to 25% of the glyphosate that's used worldwide today, and it was an even higher percentage earlier.
And this is really an integrated practice in conventional big ag, right? Big agriculture.
Big ag, yeah. You can have a huge field, very efficient. You don't really need many workers, right? It's very cheap to grow food this way. Just poison everything. And the food soaks up the glyphosate and puts it into the plant. The crop soaks up the glyphosate, and then it gets into the food. And the U.S. government doesn't care how much is in the food. They know it's in the food. They know it's widespread in the food. They don't bother to even measure it because they're like, it's safe. Doesn't matter how much is there. It's expensive to test, so why not just ignore it?
So how do we know that they know?
That they know it's in, because other people have tested it and found it. They found sky-high levels in oats and in chickpeas and garbanzo beans. People don't expect, you think these are healthy foods, the legumes. They're loaded with glyphosate. And this is because they're spraying right before the harvest. So this is another usage they've discovered that's become more popular recently as well, is to spray the crop right before the harvest. Right before you're going to harvest it, you spray the crop, you synchronize the harvest. So it all goes to seed in response to this toxic chemical. And that increases the yields, but the glyphosate goes into those seeds. And so you end up with very high levels in wheat, oats, sugarcane, and legumes, garbanzo beans and chickpeas. And
I'm mortified
lentils.
to hear that it's in chickpeas, because I lived up until now, I lived on hummus.
Yes, I love hummus, and I stopped eating it unless I knew it was organic once I realized how much was in there.
So we can still get organic chickpeas?
Yeah, we buy organic hummus at the Whole Foods.
I make my own.
Well, that's great. So I don't know. Yeah, you can probably get organic chickpeas. I don't know. I haven't tried.
Yeah, I would imagine. But also, I understand that they also often spray glyphosate as a desiccant.
Well, that's what that is, as a desiccant right before harvest, because it dries out the crop, it synchronizes the seed. It actually increases the sugar in the sugar cane, so it's great there too. And that they have an epidemic in a strange form of kidney failure among the sugarcane workers in Central America, in El Salvador. Sugarcane workers are dying of a kidney disease in their 40s while they still have young children at home. It's very tragic.
What kind of?
I think glyphosate's a major player. Kidney disease, yeah, it's an odd form because it's not associated with diabetes. It's more like a toxic, the kidney gets killed by something toxic, which I think is glyphosate. And they've, of course, tried very hard to argue all kinds of things as being the cause of this kidney disease. They've really, drawn circles around the glyphosate and refused to admit that the glyphosate is cause, although there have been several papers that have been published, including some by me. I think I've published 3 so far, arguing a connection between glyphosate and this kidney failure, and others have published papers on this as well. It's also in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka actually banned glyphosate because of the damage it was doing to the kidneys of the Sri Lankan workers in the field.
That's hopeful, at least.
Yeah, that was very helpful. I think they've actually dropped the ban recently, but I'm not sure of that. Because the farmers complain and say, we can't live without it. And so they say, oh, whoops, okay. Mexico, by the way, I'm so thrilled. Mexico has just announced they're going to phase glyphosate out by 2024.
Beautiful.
I really, really hope they stick to that, because that is such awesome news. Somebody, in our neck of the woods, right, our next door neighbor, hopefully our neighbors will shame us into doing something about it, because the U.S. is just completely oblivious. There are individual cities and individual counties that are regulating within the United States, that are regulating glyphosate or banning glyphosate. It's nice to see there's a grassroots effort towards getting rid of it. But the U.S. government is completely uninterested in doing anything to cut back on glyphosate. It seems
like there is a growing awareness of it. And I believe I heard that there was a class action suit
Yes, yes, and it was recently awarded. I don't remember the number. It's not big enough, whatever the number is,
Right.
because it's a lot of people. But at least they were. It was done. I mean, it actually succeeded because there were several lawsuits that won in a jury trial. There were three of them that had happened. Maybe it's 2 years ago now. I'm not sure. I'm losing track of time. I think it was 2 years ago when it first started in September. And there were three of these trials that all of them won large amounts in a jury trial. And then, of course, they went into appeals and stuff. And I think they're still going into appeals. I don't think anybody has seen any of that money. One of them was like $2 billion. It was amazing.
Wow. Well, that's a start.
But it never got delivered, the money, But then they had this huge number of people that responded. Once those three broke the barrier, right?
You know
Then
what
a
it
huge
reminds
number of
me of?
people.
It reminds me of the tobacco wars.
It's exactly the same. Yeah, and so non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, if you have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and you can make a good case for having been exposed to glyphosate, you can get money from Bayer through a lawsuit. I mean, I think people should know that. I think there's going to be a much bigger list eventually, and I would love to see autism. I would love to see somebody win a case against glyphosate, against Monsanto on glyphosate with respect to autism.
I recently heard, first of all, you just mentioned Bayer, and we were talking about Monsanto, and I think it's important to just call out for folks that don't know that Monsanto was bought by Bayer. And I also understood that they were renaming glyphosate because too many people
that
know
would
it's
be a
like
very smart thing to do. See how long it takes people to realize that it's still the same thing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
Exactly.
interesting. I hadn't heard that.
I
Of course,
also heard.
you go ahead. You go ahead.
I also heard, and maybe you can tell us if this is true, that there's glyphosate in some vaccines. Is that true?
It is true. Yeah, very sad, very scary, actually. And there were two independent people who investigated that. Zen Honeycutt, they're both friends of mine. Zen Honeycutt is Moms Across America.
We're
awesome.
going to be having her on as well.
That's awesome. She's so great. I love her. And she's very charismatic and she speaks very eloquently and she never gets flustered. She's very, she's fantastic. And she tested several different vaccines. And Anthony Samsel is the other one who tested several vaccines. And they both independently found a consistent story, which was that the vaccines that were live virus vaccines were contaminated with glyphosate, and the ones that were not, that were basically just sort of genetic, they put in a protein or something. They didn't have an actual virus, or a dead virus maybe. They didn't have to feed them, because they were dead. They didn't have any glyphosate. And so it was suspected that the glyphosate was coming in from growing the virus in culture, where they're making no attempt to use organic food, I suspect, to feed, organic nutrients to feed the viruses. They're just giving them gelatin and fetal bovine serum and, some kind of amino acid. I mean, they're just giving them things that are likely to be contaminated with glyphosate given where they're coming from, because gelatin will come from the bones and joints of ligaments and bones of cows and pigs, and they're fed heavy doses of glyphosate in their GMO feed. So, and it goes into the bones. That's what Monsanto has shown. They found highest levels in the bones when they looked for different levels in tissues.
Monsanto's own research says that?
Yeah, and Monsanto says it doesn't accumulate, but they know it does because they radio labeled it and they found it in all the tissues.
So let me ask you about your research, because you're speaking from knowledge, but the people listening don't know that. They don't know where your authority is actually coming from. So can you tell us, how do you reach certain conclusions? What's going on? What kind of research are you doing, so that people understand you really know what you're talking about?
Yeah, my research is mostly involves reading literature and interpreting it. So it's synthesis based on the evidence of other people's work. I don't actually have a physical lab where I do hands-on research on glyphosate. I have collaborated with Anthony Samsel on several papers, and he does have a lab where he does conduct research, and he's been testing all kinds of interesting things for glyphosate, different kinds of foods, different kinds of, for example, he ordered a porcine enzyme, a digestive enzyme, several different digestive enzymes, and he tested them.
And that's from pigs.
From pigs, and they had high levels of glyphosate in them. things like trypsin and pepsin and lipase. They had, and we wrote about that in a paper that we published together. He's also gotten fingernails from people and found glyphosate in the fingernails. He's gotten breast tissue from someone who had breast cancer, found glyphosate in the tissue. So he's really getting interesting difference. He got bile acids, he found glyphosate in the bile acids. So he's looking in all kinds of interesting places and finding glyphosate in all kinds of interesting places. So he's demonstrating that it does bioaccumulate in the tissues, which is something Monsanto had done in their own studies. And Anthony acquired huge stacks of stuff from Monsanto through the Freedom of Information Act. And so he knew that their own researchers had found glyphosate in the tissue. So he was just sort of checking to make sure that it was true. And he was finding the same thing.
Wow. And so what out of your research, and it's been a long time, it's been 12 years, so I'm sure you've seen quite a lot that is shocking. But what would you say was the most shocking correlation that you were able to find, and give us an idea of what kind of background is behind that correlation?
Well, I mean, Nancy Swanson was the one who first started doing the correlations, and she published a paper together with some colleagues where she had
who is she?
Nancy Swanson. She's a doctor. She has a PhD.
Okay.
She's a physicist by training. She and I have collaborated on several papers as well.
Okay.
And she and I have also published papers together where we've looked at data and gotten correlations. We have a huge list of diseases that are very strongly correlated. They're all going up dramatically. What disturbs me is that people don't seem to mind that all these diseases are going up dramatically. Things like Alzheimer's, pancreatic cancer. I mean, these are not trivial diseases, and
autism.
Autism, of course, and that's where I started. Autism is terrifying to me, and it just went up again. They just announced that this spring, and there was just not a peep out of the media because they were all caught up in COVID-19. But, to me, it's a bigger crisis than COVID-19 when you've got 1 in 20 boys with autism in New Jersey, and that's going to be the future of the entire country. It keeps on going up, and we keep on ignoring it, even though the schools are completely overwhelmed with the burden of trying to figure out what to do with these kids.
Is there any way to reverse it? Is there any way to remediate glyphosate?
I don't know for sure, but there are some people who are offering some products that they claim are helpful. And mostly, it's things that bind. So like bentonite clay or
that's neat.
Organic matter from the soil. So fulvic acid and humic acid. These are very complicated organic molecules. They're interesting because they actually trap enzymes that are very general. There's these enzymes that get trapped in those organic molecules that are very powerful to break down lots of things. They have a very general capacity to break things down. So whether they can break down glyphosate, I don't know that that's been proven, but it's quite likely that they could, because glyphosate's not easy to break down. Most of the bacteria don't know what to do with it. They can't, it just stays pretty much intact, or it gets turned into AMPA, a breakdown product, and that's as far as it goes. So it doesn't actually, most microbes are not able to break it down completely so that you could actually use its contents as nutrients, whereas there are a few that can. Interesting, the ones that can are things like Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which is a major problem today in hospitals. There's a lot of people who are getting infected with Pseudomonas infection that they can't cure. You throw all kinds of antibiotics at it and it doesn't die, and they can end up dying from the infection. And I think that's interesting because Pseudomonas has the skill of being able to completely break down glyphosate and use its, for example, use its phosphorus atom as a source of phosphorus.
Wow.
Because it's able to break it down, it has a tremendous advantage over the microbes that are being killed by it. It's killing off the beneficial gut microbes. That's, I think, one of the most serious aspects of its process of destruction, because it's really messing up the gut microbiome.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And interestingly, the number of papers on the gut microbiome has really escalated astronomically in the past two decades, pretty much in step with the rise in glyphosate usage. As we've gotten more and more problems with the gut, we're getting more and more papers on the gut. It used to be it just worked and you didn't worry about it, but now that's not true anymore. And of course,
I understand that there's a correlation between gut health and autism and Alzheimer's and dementia.
It's all connected. Yeah, gut health is really central to all kinds of diseases and all kinds of autoimmune diseases and brain diseases. Disorders can be traced. Parkinson's disease, for example, very clearly traced back to the gut. autism, and so the gut, when the gut's not working properly, pretty much all hell breaks loose. All kinds of things go wrong. It's really crucial to the success of the organism.
And so are you seeing that that the issues around having glyphosate, I'm going to say glyphosate poisoning, the issues around having glyphosate poisoning are originating with our food? Or is it?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually, because I was trying to figure out right from the get-go. Once I started looking at glyphosate, I was saying, well, where's exposure coming from? Is it predominantly from the food or from the water, or is it from the air with people living near the farms where it's being sprayed? Of course, all of those things are happening, but sort of like, what is the worst part? And I think the worst part is the food. All this processed food that's loaded up with glyphosate, the entire population is getting exposed, and those who eat more processed foods are getting exposed more. But everybody's getting exposed to the food. Lately, I've been concerned about the air, and I've talked a lot about that with respect to COVID-19. Very, very interesting story emerging there, because I'm linking glyphosate exposure from the air due to the development of biofuels being sourced from foods that are contaminated with glyphosate. I'm thinking that that's causing people to breathe in glyphosate. And when they breathe it in, they get it into their lungs. And that harms their lungs in such a way that they can't respond properly to the COVID-19 virus. And they end up having a very acute reaction to the infection that can take you down.
So you've seen a lot of correlations, but there aren't currently any studies on that yet. Is that true? Or
yeah, again, I'm just sort of a lone wolf speaking howling in the wilderness, trying to wake people up to this possibility. It's quite interesting because when you look at the data it's quite striking when you look at, for example, the United States and the problems we're having with over like 115, 120,000 deaths at this point and counting. It doesn't seem like we're controlling it, and we're being yelled at for not being social distancing enough. But, you look at Taiwan. It's got a pretty big population. It's got big cities with polluted air even. Like I lived in Taipei for a while, and it is very polluted. Mm-hmm. But Taiwan uses very little glyphosate. They have no GMOs, and they have zero biofuels. So their air is not polluted with glyphosate. It's polluted with other things. But they're perfectly fine with COVID-19. They've had 7 deaths. Last time I looked, which was recently, 7 deaths total in the entire country.
That's and incomprehensible.
Only a few hundred infections and 7 deaths. And people use Taiwan as a role model, say, oh, they were so great. They did such a good job of tracking those people who, came in and whatnot. Well, maybe so, but, you ought to think maybe it's something else. Maybe that's not the whole story. We keep criticizing ourselves for not doing a good enough job at social distancing, but maybe it's something else. We're poisoning our population, especially the people who live in the cities, and especially the cities that are highly into this biotech solution to replacing fuel, like diesel fuel with biodiesel, adding bioethanol to the gasoline, even heating oil, driving from bio sources. I mean, they're basically pouring. If you take a wheat field, you harvest the wheat, you've sprayed it with glyphosate just a few days before. Now you take the stalks and you put them on a barge and you send them down to New York City and you run them through a factory, and out comes biodiesel fuel.
Or ethanol.
Yeah, ethanol, biodiesel, biogas, which is the one I've been really interested in lately, biogas. And New York City actually has an incredibly interesting story about their sewer system that I've been learning more about every day. But they have this huge 50-acre place next to this incredibly polluted creek called Newtown Creek that separates Queens from Brooklyn. Queens and Brooklyn were the most heavily damaged. They had the highest infection rate, highest death rate of everybody in New York City, all the districts of New York City. And New York City is the epicenter of COVID-19 in the United States. So it's like the epicenter of the epicenter is this Queens and Brooklyn, with this creek and this 50-acre unit that has been managing the sewer system of New York City since 1967. And they did a whole overhaul in 2010. They got some money as a toxic waste site. They got some money from the government. They built these big digester eggs. So they have several of these big eggs. They're apparently quite a landmark in New York City. And those eggs are anaerobic digesters. And they not only put the sewer in there, all the sewer waste, but they also put in other stuff. Food waste, and just whatever they can find. It looks like to me they're just adding these things in to increase the yield of biogas. And then they get so much biogas now, apparently they can actually sell some of it to the municipal system. So you've got this biogas going into the pipes into the city, and old cities have leaky pipes. So I imagine you're getting biogas leaks from pipes underground in those areas that are leaking glyphosate that's in that fuel, because the anaerobic digester does not get to a particularly high temperature, not high enough to break down glyphosate. And many microbes don't know how to break it down. So I'm thinking it's surviving and ending up in that biogas. Also, biodiesel probably has it. I mean, I don't know. This research needs to be done, of course, but no one's doing it, you know.
We want to put out a call to anybody that has the funding or the resources to be able to look into it further. It's sad, actually, because the solution of creating biogas is a really, really laudable effort and well-intended effort, and it would be really sad if it had these side effects and consequences. You know, when the motivation is a good motivation, let's recycle, let's reuse, let's not. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting with it, because I've been reading about the whole sewer system in probably in the world, but in the United States, way back when, we just dumped it out into the ocean, and we realized we were harming the plants. I mean, harming the animals in the sea. So then there were laws that were passed that we had to keep it on the land, and we've developed all these facilities for breaking things down with microbes and whatnot to remove all the bacteria, you know, that are in the sewer, and clean it up, and then to use that waste as a fertilizer, you know.
Yeah.
And so, but when you think of humans and all the drugs that we take, and all the toxic cancer drugs, and the statin drugs, and the metformin, and all these drugs, on top of all the chemicals we're getting from our foods, that's all going to end up in that sewer system.
Sure.
So that's going to be extremely toxic stuff, I think. And very concerning that we're no longer, I mean, I don't want to dump it into the ocean, you know, but if we weren't using all these chemicals, this would be a great nutrient. I mean, obviously manure is a good fertilizer, it's sort of the natural way things work. But we've ruined it because we've got so many toxic chemicals in our environment.
I wonder, well, let's back up a little bit to see some of the correlations that you've, besides this gas idea as a transmitter of glyphosate. I wonder if you have an opinion about why there are so many surges now in the number of cases in other states that are not subject to the kind of epicenter or the kind of gas and sewer situation that we see in New York. What do you think
people, of course, are loosening up about social distancing, so they're offering a better opportunity. I think when you look at Taiwan, it suggests to me that if you had a healthy immune system, a person with a healthy immune system doesn't spread the disease. They get infected, they clear it away right away, and they don't spread. But a person with a weak immune system is going to spread the disease. And so when we've got a whole population with a weak immune system, because we're all glyphosate messes up, for example, vitamin D. Vitamin D activation is impaired because glyphosate disrupts the cytochrome P450 enzymes that activate vitamin D. So we have an epidemic in vitamin D deficiency, and vitamin D is a very important factor in the healthy immune system. So just that right there is going to be a factor. The lungs are, so the lungs of the people in right near that 50-acre plant, it's been shown that they have 25% higher rate of all these different lung diseases, like bronchitis and asthma and COPD. You know, they have higher rates in the area around that plant than they do in the rest of New York City. So it's really suggestive that there's something toxic going on there.
Yeah.
And I think that our whole country is basically poisoned. We've been chronically poisoned for many years by glyphosate. And so pretty much anybody who lives in this country has a weak immune system. And so we've got a tremendous opportunity to spread. Once you get your lungs infected and your immune system's too weak to fight it off, so the virus multiplies, you cough it back out, lots more are available for the next person to breathe. So it's going to be tremendous difference in the ability to transmit infection between a place like Taiwan and a place like the United States, across the board, I think across the entire country.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, we understand that glyphosate is impacting our gut in a very extreme way, killing off the microbiome. compromising us with vitamin D. What do you have a clear path to things that we can do to bolster our chances against COVID?
Yes, certainly eating a certified organic diet, number one.
It really is that important.
I think it's very important.
It's not a matter of wash your vegetables well.
Eat a certified organic diet. Yeah. And I can tell you a personal story with my husband, because he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, probably 30 years ago. And at one point he was taking 2 different drugs and pretty high doses of these drugs. And he gradually cut back. He started going organic about 8 years ago when I discovered glyphosate. And we were very strict. When we buy at the grocery store, we always buy organic. And his diabetes numbers started improving, and he started cutting back on his drugs systematically. He's very careful. And he went over, eventually he got to the point where he canceled all of his diabetes drugs, and his most recent number on the hemoglobin A1C was the lowest he's ever seen. So he basically disappeared the disease simply by eating certified organic.
And not doing vitamin D supplementation or anything else to clear the glyphosate from his gut, or?
Yeah, I mean, he takes some supplements, but I don't think, maybe that's playing a role, but because obviously there are other things you're always doing to try to improve your health. But we eat an extremely healthy diet, and it's not just certified organic, but also lots of fresh vegetables and fresh fruits. We eat meats and seafood, I think, is very healthy food. Eggs are very healthy, cheese. Try to minimize the consumption of carbohydrates is sort of a general, particularly for the diabetes, right? Things like potatoes and rice. And he tries to minimize those, but he eats them. It's not like he doesn't eat them at all. So his diet is quite mixed, quite varied, but we don't really eat any heavily processed foods. So no soy protein bars. That's kind of the soy milk drinks and the soy protein bars. I would consider those to be not worth eating. They're not food, in my opinion.
Because why? Like soy milk, why?
Well, they're just, typically, if you look at the ingredients, they've got a whole bunch of stuff that looks like chemicals. It doesn't look like food. It's a huge list of ingredients. Some of these things have like 50 ingredients, and they're basically disassembling the foods into chemicals and then mixing the chemicals back together to make pseudo foods. And I think those foods should be eliminated from the planet, actually. I think they're not doing us any good, even without the glyphosate.
You actually said something earlier about processed foods. And it sounds like we're not going to escape glyphosate by eating fresh fruits and vegetables unless they're organic.
Absolutely.
And with processed foods,
organic processed foods you could eat, but I wouldn't. I mean, because I think it's much, when you eat a whole food, you're getting all the things. There's a lot of complicated molecules in fruits and vegetables that you will not get any of if you eat soy protein bars all day long. You're going to miss out on all kinds of, even things like chlorophyll, but all these complicated polyphenols and flavonoids that are in these, especially herbs. So herbs and spices, we eat a lot of herbs and spices. They're very, very healthy. And, curcumin, so turmeric is a really, really healthy herb.
Anti-inflammatory, I understand.
It's just got all kinds of benefits. And garlic and onions and ginger. We eat tons of all of those.
Homemade fermented foods.
Yes, absolutely. Fermented foods are fantastic. And in fact, they may even have microbes in them that can break down glyphosate. I think that's something I've talked about. I learned that Acetobacter are among the few microbe types some of the Acetobacter can break down glyphosate. And Acetobacter is a common element in these fermented foods. So whether they have the kind of Acetobacter that can break down the glyphosate is not clear, because I don't think the research has been done, but I'm hoping that that's the case. And that may be one of the reasons why they're so beneficial. But also fermented foods are good in general for lots of other reasons.
And when we're talking about fermented foods, we're really not talking about things that are pickled in vinegar or vinegar and sugar. We're talking about foods that are naturally fermented using salt and some other spices and seasonings.
Like sauerkraut.
Yeah, like a natural sauerkraut, not a boiled sauerkraut. You have to pay attention. If it's refrigerated, then it's going to be healthier. As a general rule, we'll say.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it is interesting that you have to look at all these details, that to make sure you've got something right. Because I think grass-fed beef is a very healthy food, but the CAFO beef, the beef from the confined animal feeding operations, is probably very toxic.
Not to mention what they're doing to the animals.
Well, I know exactly. It's not humane either. So, but I think that the grass-fed beef ought to be something that we bring back as much as possible, because it really turns grass into something we can eat. We can't eat grass, and there's lots of grass. There's lots of grasslands, and so that would be definitely a way to get the cows off of the CAFO farms and back on the grass would be, I think, a very good thing to do. And that also improves the quality of the grass, which actually then, it makes a big difference if a cow is living on grass versus if it's in a CAFO situation where it's producing a lot of methane gas that's working against climate change. But with the grass, the cow naturally fertilizes the grass. It encourages the grass to grow, and in growing, the grass captures the carbon from the air. So you actually end up with a good argument for why it would be okay to eat beef from an ecological standpoint.
Well, I understand that using animals rotationally as part of regenerative agriculture really helps to restore the land.
Exactly. Yes, it makes the grass much healthier. So it's sort of it's a natural ecosystem.
Yeah, and not even just the grass, but the soil.
The soil, absolutely. Yeah, because the grass, of course, is helping to heal the soil.
Yeah, exactly.
The whole system, and the microbes that are helping the grass are also helping the soil. So the whole thing works out. Really, I think we need to admit that we have to spend more resources on growing our food, and that we're going to win back in spades with the reduction in our healthcare costs. Because right now, it's so funny, our country has the cheapest food in the world relative to our income. And we have by far the most expensive healthcare in the world. And those are connected.
Look at the industry skew.
Yeah.
It's like in a way, it almost serves the pharmaceutical companies that we do have cheap food that we consume that promotes our illnesses. Not to get into conspiracy theory, but wow, right?
It's so, and of course, Bayer is mostly a pharmaceutical company. So why are they buying Monsanto?
Right.
They probably understand that as long as we can keep on poisoning people, we'll keep our income really high, because people are desperate.
Well, the statistics that you're citing about autism and the statistics that we see about Alzheimer's, there's probably also, I'm guessing, a correlation with fertility rates too.
Yeah, absolutely. We're definitely suffering from tremendous declines in fertility. And there was actually a really interesting study recently done where they exposed pregnant mice to glyphosate, and at a level that actually didn't harm them. And they seemed to be fine. And they went ahead and had their litter, and the litter was fine too. And then the litter grew up, and they got pregnant and brought the second generation in, and they went on to the third generation. And remarkably, they found evidence of harm in the offspring and in the offspring of the offspring. So the grandchildren were affected by the exposure of their grandmother during her pregnancy. And that was the only exposure they did. The rest of them, they weren't exposed. Wow. And it was a low exposure. And nonetheless, it affected the germline. And there was a memory of that in the epigenetics that ended up affecting the quality. The placenta was inflamed, and the birth was premature, and the animals were too small. And there was an incredibly high incidence of deformities that would way beyond what you would expect. There were like 3, and there should have been 0 of these major deformities in the offspring of the third generation.
It seems like we're racing to the extinction of our species.
I feel that way. Yeah, it's very sobering, and that's why I keep on talking, even though I'm getting a lot of pushback. I feel like I have to keep on trying to get my message out, because it's so important, and people need to wake up. And I think our country is going to really suffer badly from COVID-19 because of our careless ways in the past with exposing ourselves to all these chemicals. Not just glyphosate, right? We're pretty happy about all kinds of chemicals in our food. It doesn't seem to make us worry, which is really a huge mistake. And as a consequence, we have this across the board weak immune system that's allowing COVID-19 to go on fire in this country. And Brazil, by the way, is the same. Brazil and the United States are way out front as far as leaders in the biofuel industry. They consume many more biofuels than the next country after those two. Those two really stand out. huge amounts of biofuels, huge amounts of glyphosate, and huge amounts of COVID-19. Both of those two are the number one, number two in terms of the number of deaths. Like we have 4.2% of the world's population with over 25, I think it's like 26, 27% of the number of deaths from COVID-19. So way overrepresented in terms of the number of deaths. And Brazil has 2.7% of the world's population with 11% of the COVID-19 deaths.
Wow.
You know, so it's all correlating rather convincingly, in my opinion. And I just think some people need to take a look at this. Some courageous researchers who can do the research need to figure this out.
Well, the rise alone in the autism rate, and you said boys, 1 in 20 boys. So it's disproportionately targeting male children.
Yeah, it's like 3 or 4 to 1, boy versus girl.
Well, projecting that forward, it's devastating for our society, for our civilization, for our culture. What do we do to sound the alarm so that people start paying attention, so that we can get some kind of action? Do you have suggestions?
I wish I had better suggestions. I just keep telling everybody who will listen to me to please spread the word in whatever way you can, you know. And I think people can do local activism. They can work at their local government level to try to get glyphosate restricted. I think that can be effective in the city or in the county, you know, at the local level. It's very difficult to work at the U.S. level because the EPA has been so brainwashed by the industry, and it's not in their best interest to go against the industry because of the kind of funding, you know, the way the whole system works. It's just they don't seem to be able to hear it.
Is there, you have so many resources on your website, which we are going to make available on the page for this interview on the sustainabilitynow.global website. But I'm wondering if within all of your resources, if you have some kind of PowerPoint or something that people could download and make available or present to their representatives to start making this more of a public outcry to recognize the upsurge and the impact that this rise in autism is going to wreak on our country.
Already has, you know, really, it's really been tragic. Yeah, I provide most of my slides from various talks that I've given through the years are provided on my website, and I'm happy for anybody to take those slides and repurpose them any way they like. I put them there for that reason, because I really don't care about even if they acknowledge where it came from. They can, but They don't have to.
Well, even that is phenomenally generous, and thank you from me and from everybody on listening and that cares about where we're headed with this stuff. I'm just wondering, you have so much on your website. I'm wondering if there's any one that you could recommend the title to for people to look at first. As a resource. I'm putting you on the hot seat here.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, because
it's
overwhelming, but I think people can browse and see what they can find. Yeah.
And there are groups that are really focused on combating this issue of glyphosate, the rise in autism, that people that are really up in arms about it. And so that gives us, there are resources there, I'm sure, that we can.
Right. Yeah, and people can reach out to people like Zen Honeycutt, Moms Across America, because people can help out there and especially she really advocates for people to sort of work locally and have meetup groups and just basically trying to spread the word, because people just need to be informed, and they need to get past their biases to think that this can't be true because our government says this chemical is safe and we believe the government. That's what you have to get past, and that's hard for people.
It's true. And I've seen so much information that is debunking the fear of glyphosate.
Yeah, I know.
And there's such, as you said, such overwhelming evidence. It's like, when do we start paying attention, at least to ask the questions, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think people aren't aware of the degree to which the industry has power to control the government and then to control the media. So we're getting a message that's false, and people need to realize that. the money is what's behind all of this. It's keeping it going. I mean, I think these people are so unscrupulous to not care about the damage they're doing, not just to the humans, all the animals on this earth and plants are suffering from glyphosate contamination everywhere.
I remember reading from Monsanto's own website or papers that their intention was to own the food supply.
Yeah, that's funny. They would just simply say that. It's pretty clear that's what they have in mind.
Oh my
And,
heavens.
yeah, it's really scary. And of course, the GMOs are another whole issue that we could talk about, but that's scary also. And they're developing this new CRISPR technology, which the EPA has decided is not a GMO technology. So they can use CRISPR now to design so-called non-GMO, but designer genes for plants to have them resist glyphosate. They won't even have to label it as a GMO.
Wow. Wow. So now I remember that there's still probably quite a lot of controversy, not in the circle that I travel, but quite a lot of controversy in general public about the merits or demerits of GMOs. And supposedly, or the line we were fed was that it's going to help feed people around the world and end hunger.
Right, that's the line.
And so maybe you can say, like, why are GMOs dangerous besides the fact that they're putting chemicals into the modified seed, for instance? Why are GMOs dangerous?
Yeah, I mean, certainly some of the GMOs are actually introducing a toxin into the plant, such as the Bt toxin, and other GMOs like the glyphosate ones are introducing a resistance to an herbicide, allowing them to use that herbicide more generously. So I think a big thing about the GMOs is simply more toxic chemical exposure. But this CRISPR technology is quite not new and not very well understood, and it could do some very surprising things to the genome. I don't think they really understand what they're doing. I think we're playing God with inadequate information about what is going to be the outcome of what we're doing. So I think there could be some catastrophic consequences that are completely unexpected, simply because we don't understand what we're doing.
Can you be a little bit more specific, just in terms of, we're not speaking this as fact, you're saying that hypothetically something disastrous could occur, and so many people have believed that, but they don't have your scientific background. So for you, with your background, to be saying that, you're speaking with a lot of knowledge, and I'm wondering what your perspective is on it.
Well, the thing that I know about the CRISPR technology is they claim it to be very precise. That with precision, you can change the genome in a way that you know what you're doing and you understand what you're doing, and it's the thing you want to have done. But what they're finding is that CRISPR has all kinds of other things that can happen that they hadn't anticipated, that the big swaths of the gene could be deleted. I mean, it can really change the genome in ways way beyond the precision insertion or whatever precision change they had intended to make. They can't restrict it to just do that. It'll do random things, who knows what. And they're trying to get into CRISPR technology to, for example, fix genetic defects. If you have an embryo, like a fertilized egg, and you know it has a serious genetic defect, to go in and actually use CRISPR to get rid of that defect. It sounds awesome.
It does sound awesome.
But there's all kinds of other things that are going to happen that you wouldn't have expected that could end up producing some kind of a monster, completely abnormal child in ways that we will have no idea what it could be. When you see the kinds of things they're observing it now, and the papers are starting to come out that are showing that it's not controllable. CRISPR misbehaves in ways that we didn't expect. And so I think that's very sobering for the people who are working on CRISPR. I'm sure they feel like it's a major setback. And hopefully they'll be cautious. But I think we're rushing into a future time that we are playing around with things we don't understand well enough when it comes to genetics. And we're going to end up with just even COVID-19 could be an example of a catastrophe that was a consequence of our efforts. I don't know if you followed all the stuff about the origin of COVID, of the SARS-CoV-2.
I've heard very mixed reviews. I heard that the original SARS showed up after some kind of earthquake that impacted a lab. But I don't know what's true, what's not true. I don't know. Maybe you have
Yeah, well,
following it more closely.
there is some substantial evidence in favor of a accidental release from a biolab in Wuhan, where they were working on vaccines. One theory that Montagnier was a Nobel Prize winner for AIDS, discovering the AIDS virus. He's a friend of mine, and he has a theory which I find very interesting, that he suspects that they were trying to develop an AIDS vaccine. And they were doing that by inserting segments of the HIV virus into coronavirus, hoping they could maybe produce some kind of a vaccine that would give you antibodies to HIV, but using a coronavirus, which is a fairly innocent virus that might cause a cold at worst. So you could do a vaccine where you could maybe get a cold, but then you'd be immunized against AIDS. I think that there was a concept that they were trying to develop something like that. And therefore they had inserted this segment, because there's this segment in the SARS-CoV-2 that resembles the AIDS virus, which is quite interesting. Wow. And other people are saying that they were doing a lot of, which I would totally believe, because they were working towards a vaccine. The idea is that they were trying to come up with a vaccine
for AIDS,
for anything. I mean, even for coronavirus. So they could have been developing a vaccine for the SARS. And so they were doing sort of transferring from one species to another to get a version of the virus that would infect a human cell line. And you can do all that in the lab, and you can accelerate the rate at which it can cross species by a huge amount if you do that in the lab. And that they had succeeded then in getting a version that would, and there's this whole gain of function stuff too, where there was a whole paper that I read from 2012 that was quite fascinating. And one of the authors was from this Wuhan lab. And they were surprised that they had created this virus that had a gain of function, which meant that it was more infective than its predecessor through these mutations that had happened in the process of developing this virus. So they're doing a lot of scary stuff in these labs, and including
tremendous arrogance.
Tremendous
to believe
arrogance.
that we understand.
And yeah, they're somehow not. It's kind of like, oh, what could go wrong? You know, they're just like, these people are sort of mad scientists who aren't thinking about the possible consequences. They're just not thinking about that. And so it's quite possible, I think, that the virus was created in the lab, accidentally released from the lab, and then caught hold in Wuhan, which is a city with a lot of pollution. So that would have meant that the people would have an easier susceptibility to spread the disease and get it all started. And it would be just really sad if that's true, because it's the vaccine industry. So now we're working really hard to develop a COVID-19 vaccine, which you have to question the sanity of that in this context.
Right. And going back to what can we do if we're poisoned by glyphosate already, besides eating organic? Will the glyphosate purge from our system, or is it there to stay? Is it cumulative? Yeah. How does it work? Do you know?
It accumulates in the tissues, and I think it gets very, very difficult to get it out of the tissues once it's there. I don't really know how to do that. You certainly have to boost your immune system, because you need to be able to clear garbage. You probably have glyphosate contaminated proteins in your body that are hard to break down and that are causing things like Alzheimer's disease. So they're very, very serious. And you need to be able to have an efficient system to be able to break those down. And the sulfur system gets messed up by glyphosate. I've written about that in many papers. Sulfur is absolutely essential for being able to break down these cellular debris. So you get into a really bad situation where your sulfur system's broken. You can't clear these proteins, these wayward proteins that are contaminated with glyphosate, have misfolded. You can't get rid of them, and then they're causing disease. And so I think certainly boosting your sulfur supply. I eat lots and lots of sulfur-containing foods, lots of garlic and onions and seafood and eggs and cheese. These are all good sources of sulfur.
Some people have a sulfur allergy or reaction, right? Sensitivity.
Yeah, and I think that's likely in many cases due to glyphosate, because glyphosate messes up the gut microbes' ability to convert inorganic sulfur into organic sulfur.
And please, anybody listening to this, do not go supplement sulfur. Don't go taking supplements without your doctor's recommendations
Right.
without, right? So let's make that disclaimer here. We're
Right,
not
right.
promoting that.
Yes, I like Epsom salt baths as a way to get sulfate directly through the skin, and magnesium sulfate. Magnesium is probably good too. So I regularly use Epsom salts for to help boost the sulfur. I'm very determined to get plenty of sulfur and also plenty of sunlight. I think sunlight exposure to the skin, not only for the vitamin D, but also because I believe sunlight catalyzes the synthesis of cholesterol sulfate in the skin. And I believe cholesterol sulfate is a very, very important nutrient to help supply the body with both cholesterol and sulfate.
Beautiful. So we've been talking for an hour. It's hard to believe.
Yeah, it went fast, didn't it?
It really did. And we could go on and on and on. I'm sure you're such a wealth of information. I'm wondering, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you? You
So
feel
it's a
is
thing to do
important
at the end.
for people to know?
Yeah, nothing comes to mind.
Well, then we did well. Besides the huge collection of resources that we're going to link to on your website, are there any other websites or books that you'd recommend for people to be checking out to really get their own education about this?
Well, one thing is I'm working on 2 books actually on glyphosate, and so we'll see if I can manage to get those published. I'm hopeful, particularly for one of them, to show up next spring, so coming up in the spring. I don't have a title yet, but it's I'm working on books myself on glyphosate. Haven't published them yet. I wrote an article about the COVID-19 connection. I wrote that and published it on Jennifer Margulis's blog site. So if you type Jennifer Margulis glyphosate or something like that, you probably can find this, or COVID-19. You could type a few keywords and this would probably come up, I would think, that you could.
Could you spell Margulis?
Margulis, Jennifer Margulis. Yeah, so that's an article that I wrote that's for the lay public, so it's pretty accessible, about my theories about glyphosate and COVID-19.
And so I just want to be clear with folks that we're presenting this information for you to be discerning and listen and do your own research, like really look into the papers that Dr. Seneff provides. Do your due diligence. It's beholden to all of us to be aware of what we are subject to in our environment, and please take action. Take action to defend your right to clean water, clean food, clean air, because if we don't do it, it's not going to happen, right?
Right. That's absolutely right. Yes, we need to fight. I think we're in a desperate situation, particularly in this country, and it'll be very sad if the United States has to go down in order for the rest of the world to learn the lesson, and that we don't make it in time. I think it's quite possible.
And the biggest thing here is to keep an open mind and read and learn, rather than dismissing with a bias, because there's so much information that is actually being censored now. And you said you've had a lot of pushback.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm sure I'm being censored, and it's very difficult for me to publish in mainstream journals. They don't even get. I don't even get to the review process. They kick back my papers without review.
Well, so and you are a senior researcher at MIT.
Yeah,
and we say it again.
They know that they know that I work on these controversial topics, and they don't want to go there. That's all I can imagine.
So the request for everybody listening is that you don't dismiss out of hand something that doesn't necessarily adhere to your foundational understanding, because we really have been subject to biased information. It's beholden upon all of us to maintain our sovereignty and to do our due diligence. Educate yourself. Don't assume that everything you're being told is the whole story. Right?
Yeah, it's really unfortunate that you have to look past all the stuff that's coming at you from the media, and you have to wake up and realize that you're being duped. I think it's very sobering for people to face up to that.
Yeah, with so much information, it's hard not to want to sort and just say, no, I'm not looking at that. But this is our health and this is our future. And if we don't preserve that, we really have nothing.
I know, that's absolutely true.
Well, Stephainie, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being the independent voice in the wind, and for really carrying that banner for us all.
Thank you.
It's really deeply appreciated.
Thank you. And same to you. I mean, you've done a lot too, and I really appreciate people like you. So everybody needs to do their part, I think.
That's right. And we all can. We all
Mhm.
have a voice. We all have something that we can do, ways that we make a difference. And
Absolutely.
just step up, show up, speak up, right?
Yeah, I think people need to be empowered. They need to recognize that they have power, because a lot of people probably feel helpless.
Yes.
And they shouldn't. They should just find a way, use their skills, and get in the fray and do something about it.
Yes. And if nothing else, it'll make you feel less hopeless.
I know. At least you're fighting, right?
at least you're trying, right?
Yeah, right.
Exactly. Well, I want to say thank you to
Thanks.
Stephainie, and I want to say thank you to our producer and my co-founder, Scott Billy, and of course to all of you who are listening and supporting us and carrying the baton and speaking up and making a difference. So that's it for today. And until next time, live your best life, love the world around you, and together we can save the world.
Thank you for listening to Sustainability Now. Visit sustainabilitynow.global to find resources related to today's program. While you're there, pledge your support by making a contribution to help us shape a world that works. And remember to subscribe, share, and follow us on social media.